So, should designers learn how to code and is it a good idea? Well, in this podcast episode, we'll discuss
just about that.
Hello, I'm your host Casino. I'm a digital alchemist. So, welcome to the SK podcast. And today we'll discuss whether designers should learn how to code. So, let's start with the context. Well, first of all, I ran a survey on the community tab asking you whether you were a web designer, a web developer, or maybe you just learning how to build websites, or maybe you just building a website for your own business. So here are the results. 41% of you guys and girls are web designers. 26% are actually learning how to build websites. 22% are web developers. And 11% are just learning how to build a website for their own business. I assume that many of you are using WordPress and tools like Elementor or Divi or some other page and theme builders. Now, some of you may be web designers and some of you may be pure designers that don't really touch the web. So whether you are a pure designer, a web designer, or maybe you're just learning how to build website, then I believe that you find some value in this podcast episode. Now, if you're a web developer or maybe on the other end, you just want to learn how to create a website for your business, I still believe that you may learn a thing or two in this video. Now, for the designers, the web designers, and the people that are getting started learning how to build websites, the context is also going to depend on whether or not you're working alone or in a team. So for example, if you're employed in an agency, for example, you might be the designer or the web designer and you're going to work with a team of web developers. Now, if you're a solopreneur, a freelancer, you're just going to work on your own and you're going to have to master a lot of different skills. Now, what type of code or coding are we talking about? Well, if you're a web designer, you may already know, but if you're a pure designer, maybe you don't really know the difference. Now, we'll be talking about front-end development and back-end development. So when we talk about front-end development and about coding, it's going to be about HTML, which is the structure of a page, then CSS, which is the styling component of coding, and then JavaScript, which is going to be the interaction or interactivity that you want to add to a page. Now, when we talk about code in the perspective of backend development, we're talking about a programming language. For example, PHP, although some may argue it's not a real programming language, but this is what we use with WordPress, for example. So the programming language is going to help us make decisions and push some data into the database. So going back to our WordPress example, the database would be something like MySQL or MariaDB or some other types of databases. And then we have server-side scripting, and we have a lot of different languages, but you can also use JavaScript for that. Now, it's actually more complex than that. There's a lot of frameworks, but we're not really going to focus on backend development too much today, although I will talk about it a little bit later on in this episode, but we really want to focus on front-end development, which is easier. So should designers learn how to code and is it a good idea? Well, I believe it is a good idea, but why is it a good idea? So once again, let me give you some context. And for that, I need to tell you how I actually came to web design and web development. So that was a long time ago. It was really kind of like the beginning of the internet. Well, internet was already there, but I was not too much into that. It was pretty new, right? So, cut a long story short, I went on holidays because at that time, my father went to work in South Africa. He's not from there originally, but he went to work there. So I went there for like Christmas or something. And I was there with him and my sisters and my brother. And I had a great time. It was the first time I discovered South Africa, and I had a great time. But I'm digressing. So when I came back, I wanted to share the pictures that I took in South Africa with some of my friends, And bear in mind, there was no Facebook, there was no Instagram, there was none of that. The only way you could actually share images with people, you had to scan the pictures, I'm not kidding. You had to scan the pictures. Well, there were some digital cameras, but they were really expensive and like 1 megapixel or something. So you actually had to scan the pictures and then, don't laugh, you had to send them by email. And I remember you would send them by email and then it would take like ages. You would see one line, another line, and eventually you would see the whole picture. So it was not really an option for me, especially because at that time you really had to pay like per minute, to to use the internet. Once again, don't laugh, but that was the reality. So what happened was, I thought, why not creating a page, a web page, because that was like the new thing, and I really wanted to try out. So I tried a service that was called GeoCities, if I recall, and it felt easy. I thought this was the way you create a website. It was kind of the ancestor of Wix, if you know what I'm talking about. So at that time I knew nothing about creating websites, but that made it really easy, because once the page was done with all the pictures, all I had to do is just send the link to the people I wanted to share the my trip with. So it was pretty easy. And that experience really, created something in me. I wanted to create more web pages, and I wanted to create websites because I'm a creative person. So I started creating some other web pages. And then I remember so I created the web page in one place, and I started learning little by little about some, HTML snippets. And then I remember one day I was really proud. I wanted to show a web page to one of my friends. So we were in a cyber cafe. Once again, don't laugh. And I wanted to show him one of the web pages I created. So I typed the URL, and to my surprise, I mean, all the text was there, the colors were there, but there were no pictures, the logo, everything. You have that funky icon when the image is missing. And I felt bad because I was talking about, yeah, I created this web page and I'm going to show it to you. I was really proud, and then it was not working. So I felt quite frustrated, but that frustration was actually good, because that's what triggered the will to learn how all of that web stuff was working behind the scenes. So I really started diving into HTML. And at that time, CSS wasn't that big. It was really HTML. And I started learning HTML. Then, of course, with the years passing by, the web starting to mature, and I learned CSS. And the thing is, bear in mind that at that time you had to learn everything with books. You had a few tutorials on the web, but no YouTube, none of that stuff. No professional services like Linda, although Linda appeared not that long after, if I recall. I'm not too sure anymore, but I remember it was like the far, far west. You could do like pretty much anything you wanted. All you had to do is start learning HTML, and then people were just going in all directions. The websites were really ugly, but it was the beginning. So little by little, I learned how to create simple websites. And at that time, there weren't that many people that could actually do it, especially where I was living. So eventually, I started getting some gigs. But then people started to ask me if I could create e-commerce websites, and there was no WordPress. There were some e-commerce solutions, but they were so expensive. You have no idea, it was a few $1,000s just to get something that WooCommerce can do today. And it was not even coming close to what WooCommerce can do today, but yet it was so expensive. So for many people, that was no option. But what that triggered in me is the will to understand how you could work with dynamic data. Because, when I first started, I was just using HTML, CSS, and I knew nothing about programming. So I thought that connecting to a database or to an e-commerce system would be as easy as HTML and CSS. And that's when I started learning about PHP and MySQL. And although we are not going to focus on that too much today, still, it was beneficial to learn about all that stuff. So I remember I bought a book to create a dynamic website, and the book was that thick, and it was tough because if there was an error in the book, you would just work for days on trying to resolve the solution, thinking that the solution was what was in the book, but actually there was a mistake, and you would only learn about that on the website of the author like 3 months later, after you're so frustrated and you think it's so dumb that nothing works and you're not going to make it. Well, but I'm digressing once again. So I learned about how to create a simple CMS website. And when I say CMS, so content management system, it was nothing close compared to what we have today. Basically, it was a simple system where people could create an account and manage their book collection. That was just the example in the book, and I learned how to do that. So basically, people could create an account, add a book, update the description of the book, change the picture, or delete the book that they entered in the database. It was not the web app of the century, but still I learned a lot. Then a few years later, I went back to school to have my webmaster degree, which was a mix of design development, but more focused on web development. And as I mentioned in the first episode of this podcast, I never had to show my diploma, but still, it was good. So, why am I telling you all of this? Well, the question was, is it a good idea for a designer to learn how to code? And at heart, I'm more of a designer. You know, I love design, design and web design. But I knew that for me, it was more natural. I mean, design was natural. Not that I was the best one, but it came naturally to me. I could learn very fast and on my own. But I found that coding, was a bit scary, and I wanted to learn the proper way. And that's why I went to learn web development. Now, where it helped me is that when I started creating websites and when the technology changed and tools like WordPress came in, well, before WordPress, there was Dreamweaver, but still, when tools that made your life easier as a creator of websites, when those tools came on the market, I could still use those tools, but when there was an issue, I was able to actually troubleshoot the bugs myself. And that's why I really think that if you're a designer, a web designer, or you know that you want to start a freelancing gig, maybe you're just going to work with WordPress, but if you don't know basic HTML, CSS, and at least if you don't understand how JavaScript works, you may run into a lot of issues because there will be issues in each and every project. At one point, you're going to run into some bugs. And if you don't know how it runs behind the scenes, and I'm not talking about being an expert and knowing how to code everything from scratch, I'm not talking about that. But at least if you understand how things work, you know where to look. And that's going to save you a lot of time, a lot of energy, and possibly a lot of money. Because just imagine, so if you're a freelance and someone asks you for a website, so you're going to ask them questions, get the brief, and at one point you're going to give them a quotation. And let's say that during that project you ran into the bugs that I was talking about. Let's say that you don't know how to solve the problem, but still you need to complete the project. So what are you going to do? You're going to ask some help, but eventually if you don't find free help, you're going to have to pay for it. And so you're going to waste energy, time, and possibly a lot of money. And you don't want that. Also, you may look less professional in your client's eyes because at one point, even if they're not technical, they'll understand that something is off and that you don't really know what to do to fix the issue. Now, if it's a good client, that's not going to be too much of a problem. But if it's just a client that you just met, they started working with you, then they might forge this mental idea that you don't know what you're doing. And maybe for the next project, they will go work with someone else. Now, does that mean that you need to become a full stack web developer if you want to create your freelancing or your small business creating websites for other companies? Not at all. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm really talking about is maybe you should take some time, work on a project. For me, that's the best way to learn. As I said previously, it was with books. And man, that was hard. I mean, I love reading, but reading a technical book, it's not like reading Harry Potter, okay? You need to go page by page. And as I said, when there are mistakes, I mean, it was tough, honestly. Nowadays, you get some great courses. Well, first of all, you get a lot of free courses here on YouTube. And if you don't want to learn on YouTube, you can also go to places like lynda.com, or for some people, they will go to Udemy or Team Treehouse, which I've already talked about. So you can really learn in no time and possibly for $0. Okay. So really what I would do is I would try to work on a simple project. How do I build a web page from scratch with HTML? We're just talking about HTML. And then how do I style elements with CSS? Now, honestly, HTML and CSS, I believe that in a month, you can really learn the basics and even a little bit more than the basics. And it's really not that hard. You need to get away from believing that coding is scary, because as I said, we're talking about front-end development and back-end development. So on the front-end development side, honestly, I think a month is more than enough. And I'm not talking about a month full time. I'm talking about, okay, if you take 1 hour per day, if it's possible for you to work on that simple project, you're going to learn the structure of a page. You're going to learn about responsive design. And even for responsive design, you can use frameworks, but as long as you understand how it works. But even before using frameworks like Bootstrap, that you may have heard of, I think you should really try to create one simple page, maybe with a couple of sections, and just try to make it responsive by going to look into the theory and apply. You have many examples online, so you have no excuse really. And now when it comes to JavaScript or jQuery, which is for the interaction side of things, it may be a bit more complex, but once again, you don't have to learn the whole language. You don't have to become a wizard at JavaScript. All you need to know is, how does it work? How can I get a script that I can get from the internet and really implement it the right way in a web page by following a tutorial? Because that's going to give you, first of all, the mindset, but also the thought process. Because once again, you don't need to be an expert at HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but you need to know how it works, where to find the info, how to implement. And I think that if you do that, that's going to cover 90% of your needs, especially if you're going to use a platform like WordPress. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you may want to dive a little bit into the backend development world, even though that's not the focus of this video. But once again, there are a lot of courses. You could do a very simple project just so that you can grasp how is data handled on the web, and especially if you use the combo PHP with MySQL, which is the database, or MariaDB. If you use that combo for a very small project, then you will understand how WordPress handles the code and the data. That may help you down the line, especially if you start taking on bigger projects, or if you start to create custom websites, because you may have to deal with various plugins and various new tables in the database, and that can definitely help. So that's it for this episode. I hope to see you in the next one. And in the meantime, don't forget to invest
in your success.